Hello everyone, and greetings from Australia. Before I get on to this presentation, I must say firstly a big thank you to the organisation or the organisers of the Dialogue Society for firstly putting on this forum and secondly for inviting me to be part of the forum. A little bit about myself. I'm doing a PhD at the Centre of Dialogue at La Trobe University. I also teach English language to migrants and people with refugee backgrounds. Further, with regards to my identity, I was born in England. I grew up in Australia. However, for better or for worse, and probably for worse given England's prowess or lack of prowess on the sporting field, I support England. Anyway, let's move on. My thinker is Paulo Freire, but before I talk to you about Freire, I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about why dialogue is so important for me. And I think one of the reasons is my belief anyway, that if we can get dialogue right, we can start to get society right. Not to say that we can cure all the problems in society, but at least if we can start to discuss them, then we can move forward. And why Paulo Freire? Well, that's what this presentation is about. I think initially it would be good to share with you a first-hand experience of Paulo, or not first-hand experience, but at least an experience of Paulo, as you can gather from a videotape. It comes from one of the last interviews that he actually did. Is by courtesy of literacy.org, and I hope you enjoy it. I'll see you soon. Thank you.
You ask me, Paulo, what is in being in the world, in you, that calls your own attention to you? I said, I would say to you that I am a curious being. That I have been a curious being. But in a certain moment of the process of being curious, in order to understand the others, I discover that I have to create in myself a certain virtue without which it's difficult for me to understand the others. The virtue of tolerance. It is through the exercise of tolerance that I discover the rich possibility of doing things and learning different things with different people. Being tolerant is not a question of being naive. On the contrary, it is a duty to be tolerant, an ethical duty, a historical, a political duty. But it does not demand from me to lose my personality.
Paulo Freire grew up in northeast Brazil. After doing a PhD on the educational system in Brazil, Freire developed his dialogical approach to education. Basically, it was opposed to what he saw as the prevalent banking model of education, where people were seen to be empty vessels needing to be filled with knowledge. From his perspective, people were experts of their own lives. Learning, therefore, needed to be contextualized by social and cultural meanings that were significant for them. Freire's programs were incredibly successful, so much so that he is accused of being a subversive. He was exiled. In 1968 he published arguably his most influential book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. After receiving a visiting professorship at Harvard, he took a post at the World Council of Churches, where he delivered literacy and social justice programs in many developing countries. His ideas were taken up by many organizations concerned with social justice and voice for the voiceless. The main focus for Freire's dialogical-oriented literacy programs was the cultural circle, where people discussed aspects of significance to them and questioned the social conditions that affected their lives. From Freire's perspective, Dialogue was the means for people to question their world in order to change the world, of creating new meanings about the world and liberating oneself from the barriers, both internal and external, of one's life. For Freire, justice, the oppressed, and voice were the most important aspects of his programs.
For different reasons. That is, the more the oppressed, the poor people, get the command on the dominant syntax, the more they can articulate their voices and their speech in the struggle against injustice.
Freire and Dialogue doesn't necessarily present as a step-by-step approach to dialogue, but rather as a thematic approach to group relations based on three, as identified by me, related themes. I label these as critical consciousness, mutuality, and a belief in humanity. Freire's initial thesis was that the historical, slave-orientated society of Brazil maintained both a cultural elite and a voiceless peasantry, precisely because people maintained a sense of identity aligned with these positions. In my own work as an ESL teacher, for example, many of my learners maintain a position of being a marginalized migrant even after 15 or 20 years of being in the country. Being critically aware of our constructed sense of identity is an important first step to change. Changing educational discourse towards a critical orientation was a core aspect of Freire's professional life.
My main preoccupation since I started working 40 years, almost 45 years ago, my main preoccupations had to do with the critical understanding of education. Of course, thinking of education in general, I also had to think about literacy, which is a fundamental chapter of education as a whole. Nevertheless, I also had experiences, strong experiences in this chapter of adult literacy, for example, in Brazil and out of Brazil. But the more I think of what I did, what I proposed, the more I understand myself much more as a thinker and a kind of epistemologist proposing a critical way of thinking and a critical way of teaching, of knowing, to the teachers in order for them to work differently with the students.
For genuine dialogue to occur between groups, it is important that members of the privileged group understand how they and others have been affected by privilege, as it is for members of less advantaged groups to understand how they have been affected by subordination. Accordingly, people need to understand the structures in society that both advantage and disadvantage them, and the structures of thought that do likewise. As Freire notes, people can suffer from a duality which has established itself in its innermost being. They discover that without freedom, they cannot exist authentically. Yet although they desire authentic existence, they fear it. They fear their own freedom. Or, to put it another way, they fear being themselves, and revealing themselves possibly, and revealing their innermost being to others. Accordingly, within an environment of trust and acceptance, it is dialogue, according to Freire, that enables people to jointly engage with social reality, including the reality of their own being. The power of Freire dialogue and its beauty is that such a journey towards authenticity is not and cannot be travelled alone. Rather, it is a shared journey. As Freire himself claims, the agents in a dialogue not only retain their identity, but actively defend it and thus grow together. Freire and Dialogue is ultimately based upon faith in humanity and faith in the power of people to question their world and thereby recreate their worlds. Founding itself upon love, humility, and faith, Freire and Dialogue concerns itself with recognizing the fears, ignorances, and pains within in order to overcome them and enter into a horizontal relationship with the others in which mutual engagement between the participants is a logical consequence. In my own approach as an English language teacher to migrants and people of refugee backgrounds, I find Freire's understandings invaluable. I take a four-step circular approach. We discuss our aspirations and goals, ways of achieving our aspirations, the barriers we face, and action. As trust develops, we can revisit these discussions and come towards a deeper level of self-expression. Contextualized by neoliberalism, many of my learners are required to meet predetermined learning outcomes that, if one is not careful, can potentially hold little meaning for learners. Additionally, classroom delivery can reinforce feelings of inadequacy that many learners currently hold through previous experiences of marginalization in their own country or feelings of marginalization in Australia. By shifting the emphasis away from measurable outcomes towards the aspirations, hopes, and fears of learners, learning becomes personally and potentially more meaningful. Talking with learners not as people who require English language instruction, as vessels to be filled, as people without necessary skills and knowledge, but rather as people who want to contribute and be part of society, becomes liberating as learners begin to connect with hope in their lives and believe once more in themselves. Ultimately, I have the power in the classroom, and I can choose to reinforce their lack of power or to take a dialogical approach based on criticality and understanding of reality, mutuality, a sharing a journey towards aspiration, and ultimately a sharing of our humanity.
Who says that this accent or that this way of thinking is the cultivate one? If there is one which is cultivated, this is because there is another one which is not. Do you see? It's impossible to think of that without of language without thinking of ideology and the power.
There is an acceptance, according to Freire, that dialogue is always contextualized by power, and is therefore a never-ending action as people grapple with difficult, complex processes, arriving at unfinished places in a journey of both discovery and of humanizing change. The struggle is both external between individuals and internal within individuals. Freire and Dialogue is ultimately based upon faith in humanity and faith in the power of people to question their world and thereby recreate their worlds. Founding itself upon love, humility, and faith, Freire and Dialogue concerns itself with recognizing the fears, ignorances, and pains within in order to overcome them and enter into horizontal relationships with the other, in which mutual engagement between the participants is a logical consequence. At the same time, there is an acceptance that dialogue, according to Freire, is never an easy process. People can just as easily move out of dialogue as they can move into it, questioning and naming the world and our role in it through our relationships with the other is a challenging and ultimately a risky process. As you would imagine, Freire accords or aligns with many other dialogue thinkers. The circle of seven, creating a circle, is one. Eck, learning from the other. Saunders, and the importance of trust and action. Barenboim, and the interdependence of people with difference, just to name a few. But it's Akita and Gadamer that Freire seems to have most affinity with. I could well imagine Freire, Gadamer, and Akita gathering around the table and discussing their versions and their understandings of the dialogue. In particular, I think Freire and Akita would have agreed on a number of different points, in particular over the idea that engaging in dialogue is a struggle to positively transform our own life as well as that of others, and that truth is something that all people have equal access to. I also could imagine that Freire and Gadamer having an animated conversation, especially regarding the importance of prejudice. The following thoughts of Gadamer also align with that of Freire. A person who does not accept that he is dominated by prejudices will fail to see what is shown by their light. And also, the placing of ourselves is not the empathy of one individual for another, nor is it the application to another person of our own criteria, but it always involves the attainment of a high universality that overcomes not only our own particularity, but also that of the other. I think this latter point is something Freire, with his love of humanity and of other people, would have particularly agreed to. That's all for now. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation. I'll leave you with a number of discussion points. All the best. Bye-bye.